All right, well, appreciate everybody joining us, and let's get it going here. So, I think the way I was hoping to frame this, and then we'll get some questions from the audience, is kind of past, present, and future. And some of this is taken off of our conversation last night with Steve, but I thought I'd start with Brian. And Brian, Steve mentioned scheduling, and of course some of the new events. For you, I think from a programming perspective, what are you seeing in the, how the sport has evolved, how you're thinking about scheduling, and we talked a little bit about it, what it's meant, not just in scheduling, but frankly, what it's meant to viewership.
Yeah, no, well, first of all, Al, thanks for having us and the Sportico folks, and I know our NASCAR comms guys worked hard on this event. I think it's a really cool way to kick off Phoenix Championship weekend. Hope we can keep it going, but appreciate the opportunity. This has been a lot of fun the last couple of days. In terms of how our schedule has evolved over the last 3 or 4 years, I ultimately think that you need to point to, in 2018 and 2019, NASCAR made the decision to take two companies, one company that was private, NASCAR, another company that was public, in ISC, that was the track company. We took ISC private, we merged the two companies, and we created essentially a league and governing body as well as the tracks. What that allowed us to do is take a long-term view on kind of our sport, whereas we probably scheduled a lot of our events with a short-term outlook in terms of ticket selling and what is the comp to the last event. You don't tear up a Coliseum in LA because your P&L in the short term is going to look good. You tear up a Coliseum in LA and put a race in the backyard of Los Angeles because you're trying to grow fan interest in your sport. So by privatizing the company back in 2019, what it allowed us to do is take a long-term horizon in terms of every decision that we make around the sport, whether that's from a competition perspective, whether it's from a scheduling perspective. And where I think that NBC and Fox have just been magnificent partners is that we've worked hand in hand on those scheduling changes over the last 2 or 3 years. So if we're going to go to LA, is there a window in prime time that we could take over from Fox Entertainment to have that race under the lights for the first time? So we're doing that in 2023. If we're going to have run the first street course in the history of the sport, is there an ABC window that's available essentially on July 4th weekend to make that happen? So I think we were probably previously a little guilty of scheduling maybe with an at-track point of view in mind and not taking the big picture into consideration. But if the scheduling and planning discussion is a holistic discussion between the sport, the competition folks, and then our networks, I think that's where we've been able to see some real gains over the last 2 or 3 years, and our viewership has obviously bared that out as well.
Thank you. And you guys, go ahead.
I would also add that NASCAR got out of their comfort zone, and they were willing to race on Easter. So we put the Bristol race on Easter night, and it was a 6-year high for that race. Also Mother's Day. Traditionally, they raced Saturday night, the night before Mother's Day, and they moved the Darlington race to Mother's Day, and again, spiked numbers. So kudos to NASCAR for getting out of their comfort zone.
Yeah, on that note, how much interaction happens? Like we, listening to the earlier panel and me being in the NFL, but how much interaction happens between you three, in the conversation of scheduling and where to put games? How much pushing's coming on from your side?
Way too much.
Go ahead, Rick. Sorry.
No, it's a collaboration across, all three of us and, various the team owners. I mean, in order to make something happen within a sport, it requires a lot of stakeholders to get on board. And, you mentioned the clash at the Coliseum. Like, that's great for the sport, right? That's for people that, aren't necessarily NASCAR fans hear about it. It's unique. It's a little bit of, hey, what's happening here? The street race in Chicago, what an incredible idea that is, and what that's going to do for the sport. I suspect you're going to bring in a lot of non-NASCAR fans for the first time. They'll be exposed to them. And we did some of this, too, on Peacock and USA Network with Race to the Championship, taking a page from obviously F1, but how do you tell people the stories behind the drivers? Like, get them personally invested. It's kind of a page out of the Olympics back in the day. Like, how do you get people invested to care about these drivers, their teams, the people that surround them, and that ultimately, hopefully, has a good impact on the actual race competition itself. So we've been trying to investigate and sort of telling the whole story.
Well, I'll give you one very quick anecdote to that point. So at this race last year, Phoenix in 2021, we had the Chicago Sports Commission and we had NBC in the suite. And we were literally working out dates in the calendar for 2023 that would work for both the city of Chicago, like setup and tear down of a street course, adjacency to Lollapalooza, which was setting up beforehand so we could take advantage of a lot of that infrastructure. And also we needed an NBC broadcast window, right? Because we weren't going to run up. We wanted to open that one NBC broadcast window to run the street course. So all of that was happening in real time a year ago. And sometimes it takes that much lead time to properly pull off something like that ambitious.
And for you two guys, I mean, how do you see it evolving? I mean, we talked some about not just race day, but shoulder program, how you might use your other assets or sports to co-promote sports or cross-promote sports. So how do you see the world? I know there's a discussion next Future Media. That's not my question. In general, how do you see covering NASCAR and motorsports evolving for both of your networks?
Well, NASCAR is a linchpin of the Fox Corporation. We have the benefit of starting the NASCAR season with the Daytona 500 and now the Clash. So you see a lot of promotion inside of NFL playoff games and this year the Super Bowl. So it's right up there in terms of priority for us.
Yeah, same thing for us. I mean, we obviously are lucky to have the championship this Sunday. It'll be promoted from Notre Dame Clemson. It'll be promoted from the Breeders' Cup. It's been promoted throughout Peacock and all of our various sports programs in the last couple of weeks, as we sort of head down this. But it's an anchor. It's an anchor of what we do. I mean, how many hours are on NBCU platforms, since, the end of June? It's a considerable amount of our programming.
Yeah, again, one small example. Clash is the week before the Super Bowl this year. Then you go into the Super Bowl. Then you go into the Daytona 500. This year, NBC had the Super Bowl, but Fox promoted to the NBC Super Bowl. NBC then promoted to the Daytona 500. To the extent that the league and both network partners can work together as collaboratively as they have, it's just really helped kind of rise the tide for the entire property.
And if any, how, I guess for all of you, let's start with Brian, I mean, how have you seen the demographics shift or change, right? And that, how have you, thought about the sport? What are you seeing on your networks or those who are consuming it? Has it evolved over time, and if so, how?
Yeah, so I'd say a few things there. One, the schedule changes that we make, it's not an accident that we are going into the biggest markets in the U.S., right? So LA, we're in the backyard of LA last year. Chicago, when they be at backyard, will be in the streets of Chicago next year. So we will continue to target major metro markets that do not have a NASCAR presence. The biggest reason that somebody was interested in being a NASCAR fan that is not a NASCAR fan, what they have told us is that there is not a NASCAR race close to them, right? So I live in downtown, or I work in downtown Charlotte. The Hornets are 3 blocks away from me. The Panthers are 2 blocks away from me. Because of the footprint and the scale of a NASCAR track, you're talking about a 2.5-mile track, it has been tough historically for us to put that track experience, that in-venue experience, in the backyard of our fans. So the Clash, again, the Coliseum, 70% of those ticket buyers for the Clash had never been to a NASCAR race before. 17% of those viewers that watched that race didn't watch a single minute of the NASCAR playoffs in 2021. So it's an additive audience that we're bringing in. The second piece is we're making format changes like Bill referred to in Bristol Dirt. That Bristol Dirt event was our highest rated race from an 18 to 34 perspective, other than the Daytona 500, I believe, all year. So there's a younger demo that wants different types of racing, and we need to find a way to provide that type of racing to that different fan base.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of growth across the board, particularly in, call it, men 25 plus. So overall for our season, we are at a 5-year high. NASCAR Race Hub, which is our daily NASCAR studio show, is going to be a 4-year high at the end of this year. So we're seeing a lot of positive momentum and a gain in those key male demographics.
It's also how we measure success. I think historically it's been broadcast TV ratings and broadcast TV ratings only. A key metric we look at Peacock is how many subscriptions are being driven by NASCAR. We had one instance where a race was postponed till Sunday morning. It drove a significant amount of paid subscribers to Peacock in order to watch. I think it ended up on CNBC, which may be a little more difficult to find, but we were the beneficiary of it overall. We also, as I mentioned, Race to the Championship show, but we also had Lost Speedways with Dale Jr. We have exclusive post-game show. And Brian, you had a great stat the other day, which I'll let you give to the audience.
Yeah, so we have not moved a lot of content to direct-to-consumer, specifically Peacock, yet, because the last time we did a rights deal was 10 years ago. Direct-to-consumer did not exist. But the limited amount of content that we have shifted to Peacock, which is essentially midweek shows, original programming, and a post-race show. The top 3 OTT platforms for NASCAR fans in terms of consumption is 1, Netflix, 2, Prime Video, so you would think that based on the penetration levels. But third is Peacock, and even with the limited amount of NASCAR content that's on there today, so you'd expect that to continue to grow as we put more content on the service.
And I guess as the content owner and how do you think about, we talked a little bit last night with Steve around the car, but I think the driver, right? There's in the NFL, they're underneath the helmet, maybe a little bit harder than other sports. We've seen the tennises of the world where it's like, well, it's all going to fall apart when Sampras and Agassi go away. We've had legendary drivers. How do you think about, you and NASCAR think about promoting sort of the future drivers, the future teams, what it might look like, and then you two, how do you spin off of that in your programming?
Yeah, I think that's another effort that we're all in it together. It's incumbent on the property to tell that story, but it's also really important for the networks to get behind that effort. The first piece that I'd mention is Tim Clark runs our digital businesses. Will be up here, I think, next. But his team put together a show called Race for the Championship, which is simply the most ambitious original content effort that we've ever done. All of the drivers are mic'd up. We're following kind of a full season, taking the helmets off of the drivers. You're seeing Kyle Busch go through his free agency decision in real time. Like you're watching Kyle and Samantha Busch make a decision on what team he's going to race for in 2023. So that type of access the sport has never had before. And that's one where we partnered with Rick's team on USA and Peacock to tell that story. And then in Bill's world on the Fox side, like Race Hub, a lot of original content programming comes out from NASCAR to fill FS1 on any given weekend. We usually do 3 or 4 different kind of mini documentaries per year, mostly telling the story about the drivers. So they've been great partners in terms of trying to tell the story of our personalities of our sport on their platform.
The thing about NASCAR fans, they travel. And what I mean by that is they'll find the content over any platform. So we produce, as Brian mentioned, several documentaries a year, and we'll put them on after a race, and it holds the audience. And then we can put it on Tubi afterwards. Again, just the NASCAR fan finds the content and tribute to the sport.
Fascinating. So in your guys' mind, I guess for the media partners, there is the eventual media rights coming up, and we heard from the previous group around how it's evolved. You both are evolving in your networks and your approach. I mean, how do you think about the future of this sport, the future of sports on your networks, et cetera?
I mean, I'll say, and coming from Peacock a little bit, I mean, broadcast still matters. I mean, it's the best means of distributing to the mass audience that's out there. I mean, you see it a little bit with the NFL. You see it certainly, and that's been the NFL's strategy from day one, is stay on broadcast TV. And I think for what we just talked about in terms of how to expose the sport to the most people and grow the pie, broadcast is still the best way. So I think, how do you find more windows? How do you put it into the right windows to be watched by the biggest audience? That's I still think that's the future.
Bill?
Look, I mean, in terms of the upcoming rights negotiation, look, we've been a proud partner of NASCAR for 2 decades. Hopefully that will continue. And it's a major part of Fox Corporation, as I said. So we'll get to that when the time is right.
Got it. Brian, obviously Chicago is very ambitious. You mentioned it. So, talk about thought process that went into it, and then you've mentioned some other markets that might be on the horizon down the future. What would those markets look like? How do you pick those if they don't have a standing track? So how do you think about the future of that?
Sure. So to pull together a project like Clash of the Coliseum, that was probably a 3-year effort. And Chicago was probably a 3-year effort. So when we're ready to announce something, we'll announce something, but there's certainly cities that we are looking at. If you looked at all of the tracks in the United States, or even just call it North America, you would be able to see some gaps in terms of where we are not geographically. So the Pacific Northwest is an area that we'll target. We ran an Xfinity race in Portland. This year, it's sold out despite being in the rain, and that's for the kind of lower series on Saturdays for Xfinity. So Pacific Northwest, New York market is certainly something that we're looking at. I think when you talk about expanding your sport to new demos, we think Canada and Mexico are certainly up there as well. So I think you'll see us take a really aggressive, hard look at each one of those opportunities. They have to make sense from a business perspective as well, but we're going to continue to be aggressive in this space. I would be surprised if there were not more scheduling changes that are as bold as and ambitious as kind of what you've heard with the Clash in Chicago in the coming years.
You know, you two, Steve mentioned yesterday, it's arguably the most consistent, broadcast and ratings if you look across. I mean, he spoke a little bit last night about the decision to race during COVID, kind of be the first one out. How did you see that impact around your viewership and network, given, all of us, unfortunately, were at home, not to our own doing, but how did you see that in that short window affected, and has it stayed the course? Obviously, it stayed because of high ratings.
Yeah, I think the way that NASCAR handled the pandemic, being the first sport back in a responsible way, was terrific. They kind of had the sports landscape to themselves when they came back in May. And, we were in season then and obviously took advantage of it and worked with them closely to bring the sport back and race on nights that we never raced so they could finish all the season. And I think from that point on, some things happened, as Steve mentioned last night, Bubba Wallace, social justice, and it really kind of catapulted the sport to a new level in the zeitgeist. And I think you're still seeing the impact of that. Ross Chastain last weekend was just amazing to see that happen. And obviously it went viral. And, I would expect the numbers this Sunday to be pretty darn good.
Yeah.
I think the track allows it again. Is that what I understand?
It's okay for this weekend. We'll make a determination after that, I believe, is the answer that we put out there.
Wouldn't be disappointed to see that again.
I would say, too, we're a fan of what Ross Chastain did. It was an amazing moment. What I would say to Bill's point is you started off this by talking about NASCAR getting outside of our comfort zone. I think COVID was a catalyst to allow that change, right? So we had to do all sorts of different things in 2020, and I think that changed the culture of the company internally. We were getting there, but probably incrementally, and I think it made it a lot easier to take really big swings because of what we had to go through to pull off 2020. So we're running midweek races, we're running double headers, we're running different start times. There's no practice and qualifying because we had to keep people safe. So like all of those, our playbook essentially got tossed out the window, and then we got to put it back together in a post-COVID world, and I think we've been kind of more innovative as a result.
Awesome. In other leagues, you may or may not have as much parity. How's parity impacted the sport for media partners, right? Where we said last night we had the most winners this year than any other year in history. Is it you feel like that is attributed to some of the people continuing to tune in? There's different storylines every weekend.
Yeah, I think with any sport, any fan base wants to feel like they have a chance.
Yep.
And you're able to sort of drive that through rule changes or just structure the schedule. Like that's great for fandom. That's great for tune-in. That's great to grow the largest reach you can. If
either of you could tell one story in NASCAR that you feel either is being told and needs more attention or has not been told, what would you tell and why?
I mean, the stories in NASCAR are so rich and colorful, particularly the history of it. And if you're not around it, you don't know these characters. I think there's a little bit of going back to how it began and some of the the guys that were racing on Daytona Beach and just like they're good old boy. Like it was just like there's something to it. I think that the new fans or a new generation would appreciate how they sort of took the storm and built this from scratch all the way up. That's probably a story to tell.
I also think what these drivers go through on a weekly basis to get ready for going 200 miles an hour around a track, we try to tell those stories as much as we can because, a lot of people think, oh, they're not athletes because they, drive in a car. But these guys are finely tuned athletes, and it takes a lot. So we try to tell those stories too.
Yeah, I remember when I visited, we were playing the Panthers, and I visited Hendrick, and I was lucky enough to be able to watch them train, right? And they were doing pit stop training, and I was ready to recruit a few of them to play on D-line on Sunday because they were big guys. But You're right. It is amazing what goes in and on behind the sport and the story that you can tell when you really start to dive into it. So for you, I know that there's collaboration around the scheduling, which obviously drives eyeballs. How do you view it they want original content, you want pre-produced maybe? What is the proper relationship between content owner, rights owner, and media partner as it relates to whether it's original or whether it's pre-produced by you guys?
Yeah, what I would say is you asked what story has been told that could be told. It's interesting that the example that you brought up is kind of the Hendrick pit group guy. So the NFL is essentially, the college football and the NFL are essentially like the feeder system for our pit crew, right? So these are some of the best athletes in sports, carrying a heavy tire or a gas can, trying to do a pit stop in 11 seconds. And because there's 40 cars doing that at the exact same time, multiplied by 8 pit crew members, it's hard for the Fox and NBC to give that the right amount of space within the context of a 3-hour linear broadcast. So when we talk about original content, that's where you have a little bit more time and a little more oxygen to focus on those type of things. In terms of how we program or how we work with our broadcast partners or other third parties to program NASCAR content, a lot of it is just driven by fan interest. So what are the right channels, whether it's direct to consumer or on the linear side or on the social side, to tell the right story of our sport for that specific audience. So for a Ross Chastain moment, which is probably the greatest move in NASCAR history, and it also happens to take 8 to 10 seconds, like the total clip, to get that from when he goes like full throttle outside of before turn 3 until he finishes the race. Like, that's a very TikTok or social friendly viral moment for the sport. Telling the story about how Joey Logano wins a race in Las Vegas and then has to be a really good dad the next day, like, that's a great story that Peacock and USA can tell with a little bit more oxygen and a little bit more space. So I think you try to think about, what are you trying to tell? How are you going to grow fan interest in the sport? And then what are the platforms in which you're able to tell that story in an appropriate way?
I think the Ross Chastain moment needs to be a documentary.
You can do that.
Wait, so for the audience, those who may or may not know, when you say can or can't happen again, why the question?
So there were some drivers after the race on Sunday that took exception to the move, essentially because it's never been done before. 2, because there's
Deliberate delivery on that one. Okay.
Yes, we're good at that. 2, because there's a concern about like what it could mean in the future if you just have essentially drivers whipsawing around the racetrack in terms of like competition integrity. And then 3, there's a concern just about safety. Like what Ross said publicly, and is true, is there is an access gate. Like, you literally open a gate in the middle of the wall to go from the infield to the stands. That has to be flush. That gate has to be flush if a driver is going to run around the wall. And he said it after. He's like, I'm not sure if the gate would hold, but it held. It's pretty badass that the guy thought about an access gate either being open or not open and then decided to run his way into the championship. So the drivers are concerned just long-term of what that could mean. From a NASCAR competition perspective, these are the rules that we went with for the first 35 points races of the season. These will be the set of rules or non-rules that we have for the 36 race this season. To the extent that it becomes something that we need to address at some point in the future, then we'll address it at some point in the future. But it's definitely in play for race 36.
Yeah. Bill, I thought it was the Bubba Wallace moment and then the Confederate flag and everything that was talked about last night. Michael Jordan coming in, Pitbull coming in, sort of, how have you seen sort of even more of a demographic shift there around the sport itself and the decisions that Steve and NASCAR made led to new fans and other demos?
We've seen African-American, Black viewership increases, Hispanic viewership increases. I think we've seen also social media engagement increase because of these guys. And I think it's just great for the sport. It raises the profile of it.
Yeah. Same thing on your side, right?
Same thing. Yep.
Yeah. Brian, talk about your international strategy around how you think of it, right? It's heavy North America, as we all know. What is the audience today? What do you think it can be? How do you think through the growth strategy internationally?
Yeah, Great question. So the audience today is very U.S. based. So about 90% of our viewership globally is in the U.S., 5% Canada, 5% the rest of the world. I think what you'll see us do in the coming years is get a little bit more aggressive in terms of taking the competition product to different locations internationally. Probably start with North America. What that means in the future, probably too early to tell. The way we distribute the content is we've done it similarly for the last 10 to 15 years. We distribute domestically. We do all of those rights deals in-house in Canada with Bell Media, TSN, obviously with Fox and NBC as our national series rights partners of the U.S. And then we have 2 different LATAM partners that we do those deals directly. And then our friends at IMG and Endeavor, our agency and partner, internationally distribute our content to about 195 countries and territories worldwide.
And so it's been widely reported in the Next Media rights, and I asked Steve last night around just the economics around your sport and eyeballs in linear television around team sponsorship, et cetera. So, Brian, I think for you, or as you get through this and you have your freedom to dream, like, what does it look like in the future given the known economics? Does it stay similar to now? Does it evolve, and if so, how?
Yeah, I'd start with what our property is and what it isn't. So you come from the NFL, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of games that can be split up between various media partners, whether that's Fox, NBC, CBS, ESPN, and now Amazon. We have less inventory, right? So we have 38 cup races on essentially mostly Sunday afternoons during the course of a very long 10-month season, 33 Xfinity races and 23 trucks races. The decision we make in terms of how we distribute that content becomes disproportionately more important for us because there's just less content than we have, or inventory that we have than some of our other partners. Now, the scale of that content is significant. You're talking 3 million viewers for Cup, 1 million for Xfinity, 650K or so for trucks. So the reason that's important in the team economic discussions is that linear TV is still really important to us. Reach is still really, really important to us. So we are not in the position looking ahead where we're going to move a bunch of our content over to direct consumer. There will be a direct consumer part of the next rights deal for sure. We need to be there in terms of the trajectory of the business. We need to be there in terms of the demos of the business. But ultimately, reach is just as important as anything else in terms of the decisions that we make going into next year and beyond.
Your guys' thoughts on?
Yeah, I mean, no different. I mean, we look at all of the rights we have, not just NASCAR, but how do we put the right content on the right platform? It's no secret that we're trying to grow Peacock, and that's an important initiative within Comcast and NBCUniversal. And so how do we leverage the currency of broadcast windows to get some content available on Peacock? That's the strategy overall, and we'll work with Brian and NASCAR and saying which Cup races, which Xfinity races, and what weekends and where do they go. Simulcast certainly is a big part of that. Like this race on Sunday is simulcast on Peacock and it's on NBC. And so we're just working through and trying to find the right balance.
I mean, for us, linear TV is the linchpin. Obviously, we have Tubi, which is an AVOD service, which could come into play in the next deal. But for us, it's really Fox and FS1 are the key distribution platforms for us.
And I guess we have a few minutes left here. I'm happy to take questions from the audience, but I think for all of you, and maybe I'll start with Rick first, I asked this last night of Steve, if you had the freedom to dream, what is the future for NASCAR and your network?
Growing ratings on NBC broadcast. I think that's the dream. And then look, I think this season kind of proved out. I mean, we're going to be up year over year on NASCAR across both Fox and NBC in a media environment where gravity is kind of pulling down pretty much everything else. So I think kudos to NASCAR for producing a series that's growing in this environment on linear TV. But I think the future is, like I just said, it's going to be a mix. It's going to be a mix of putting the right content on the right platforms.
Bill?
Yeah, for us, I'd echo that. I think it's continuing this growth curve that NASCAR is on, enhancing it with more innovative scheduling, new ownership coming in, like the Michael Jordans of the world. So we're just looking for continued growth.
Yeah, last thing I would say, we haven't touched on it too much because there's a heavy focus on the National Series. Our ownership, Jim France and Lisa Kennedy, own a number of other motorsports properties as well. So ARCA Developmental Series, that's with Fox, that does pretty well. There's about 300,000 viewers per event. IMSA, which is with NBC, and there's a heavy Peacock component to that. The demos for IMSA, which is essentially sports car racing, are wildly different than other demos. You're talking about like heavy high income JDs, MBAs that come through that. And then we have a grassroots racing partnership with Flow Sports that's done really well this year for us as well in the first year of the partnership. So we have all of those disparate parts that have been lined up on different terms over the course of the last 3 or 4 years because we're inheriting some of those properties. We have the opportunity to kind of put all those properties and all of those series in what we think are the right places and kind of dream big in 23 because there is some non-national series content that we think can play a major role in the growth of the sport in the future as well.
You know, Brian, on the growth, it's call it stick and ball sports. You hear a lot about youth participation up, declining, etc. You know, your sport, I think we see it as they become pros, but for those who don't know, what does youth look like? How does one get engaged in this sport? At what age? What are they doing, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is where we start talking about midget car racing and legends and bandoleros and the eyes gloss over and all that sort of good stuff. I think we need to do probably a better job of having like a developmental ladder that's a little bit more intuitive. So if I was a soccer player growing up, you kind of know what you're going to do. You're going to be a travel soccer player, then you're going to be ODP, and then you're going to hopefully be good on your high school team, then you're going to go to college. And you could eventually be in the NCAA tournament like Rick Cordella over here if you're a really good basketball player. For a NASCAR driver, it's a little less intuitive, right? So you are racing go-karts, and then you're racing midgets, and you're racing bandoleros, and all these properties that I don't expect you guys to know, but making sure that stepping stone and that ladder is more accessible so that it's a meritocracy by the time the drivers get to ARCA and trucks and Xfinity and finally Cup is something that we're focused on.
Great. All right. Any questions from the audience? Don't be shy. I was going to have everybody in their notebooks write down what they thought each network should bid on the next rights, to be honest with you. And then,
I'd be interested in that too.
Shout it out, but I decided that wouldn't be appropriate. Although Scott liked that idea last night when I gave it to him. Well, look, it's a real honor. I think kudos to all three of you as a fan and a growing fan of the sport. I think what you've done and coming out of COVID, telling these stories. Bringing on new viewers, bringing on new events. Like I said last night, I was at the Clash, and to me, I just thought it was super cool. I didn't know how the hell you were going to fit something in an NFL or collegiate stadium or football field. So I think for all of us fans of the sport, for fans of your networks, for partners of all of us, you do a fantastic job. So I just want to thank you all for your time. So give it up for this group.
Thank you.